terribly long for you, but this chapter here, chapter 8, talks about infant and toddler language and literacy and the importance of that as children are growing and developing. Okay, so the biggest thing that infants and toddlers have is receptive communication. Okay, so basically the understanding that language use, language development begins very early on in infants. And even before infants are born. Okay, it definitely precedes productive communication. So receptive, they're taking things in, they're learning, they're absorbing information, how to do things, how to communicate, etc. So speech perception is the next thing. Infants are born with the ability to perceive speech sounds. Okay, so talking about the left hemisphere of the brain, the activity there when speech is played is the right activity for music. Infants can distinguish some consonant and vowel sounds within the first few months of life, okay, and often better than adults can sometimes, especially sounds that are not in their native languages, okay. So very interesting that infants are very attuned to some differences in consonants and vowel sounds within the first month or so of life. Okay? Understanding of words begins in the second half of the first year and advances very rapidly. Okay, so after about 6 months of age, infants are beginning to understand some words and which words are used more often, depending upon culture and use in whichever language infants are being brought up in. Okay. Usually words for objects in English, okay? Words focus on compliance in some cultures with directive parenting, for example, no, names for pasta, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of different things that come up, again, depending upon culture and depending upon the use of words and terms and how often they are repeated, depends upon how soon infants and toddlers understand words. Okay, so some productive communication. Okay, some of the early on sounds, of course, crying, which we're probably all very well aware of, will be an early productive communication for infants. Okay, because that's the one thing that they know how to do internally. It's natural. Will be that crying component, whether it's something that whether they're hurt, whether they have a dirty diaper, whether they're uncomfortable, whether they want to eat, they're hungry, etc. So it depends upon individual infants. It depends upon cultures. Right away, parents are not good at identifying the meaning of the crying. Okay, they will respond to it, but not quite sure what that might mean right away. At some point, you will start as a parent. They will start to distinguish, and as a caregiver, the difference between a hurt cry, maybe a hungry cry, or an uncomfortable cry. Okay, so that makes a difference as you get to know the infant. Okay, noises and gestures are part of that productive communication as well, not just crying. But as infants grow and develop, they'll start to pointing, they'll start to make certain sounds, noises, do certain things that mean or that are a part of a communication component for the infant. Babbling, of course, is the repetitive vocalization of something, typically open vowel sounds. That could be considered that cooing component. Okay, consonants around 4 months old, not necessarily always in the native language that they are being spoken to or being brought up in. There is some lalation, ma ma ma, ba ba ba, da da, those types of things. That is starting to be more present. And then some expressive jargon where there's stress and intonation is added to kind of some either some babbling or some different kind of vocalization, or maybe seems like they're trying to say something, but they're adding that stress and intonation in there. So babies learning 2 languages have 2 distinct babbling styles. Very interesting with that. And so if there is multiple languages being spoken at home or in the household, there will be some different babbling styles that go with it. First words for infants and toddlers, typically between the ages of 8 and 18 months. Very wide range, right? So there's There's no need for concern if at 12 months a baby is not speaking some first words. Okay, some are later than others, some are earlier. It just kind of depends. So, and that goes back a little bit to environment as well. What, how much is being spoken to them, being read to them, how much are they involved in conversation or other adult conversation. So the first words aren't always intelligible. We can't, don't know what they mean. They're not always accurate with their meaning. Call that over restriction, where there's limited use, or there's an over generalization where it's broad, largely broad. In that, so there's some differences in style, right? Expressive and or referential. Okay? So expressive is more so in the social setting, playing with their friends or with their siblings, caregivers. Referential then is specific, naming an object or doing a certain task, for example. So temperament and culture both influence style in regards to what that the style of what is being used or the language, the first words. The naming game can promote vocabulary growth. A good example in the book for you to take a look at in regards to the growth of vocabulary for these youngsters. Okay. When we talk about dual language learners, though, infants include words from both languages as a single vocabulary. So they kind of mix them together a little bit, maybe combine them together. The total vocabulary about the size of a monolingual child, but the proportion from each language depends, of course, on the exposure. So they're kind of mixed together up until 18 months. And then once they grow a little more and develop a little more, they're able to start distinguishing them and separating them into, I guess, the appropriate categories for each of that language. So single concepts rarely have labels in both languages. Sometimes the two words are combined into a single word, which is quite common when with infants who are using or exposed to multiple languages. Okay? There's a lot of two-word utterances then that come and develop. And so where a child, infant or a toddler is trying to communicate and is starting to understand some of the concepts that involve grammar and syntax and language. Examples they give here, the me bite or all wet. So they're trying to express themselves. They just don't know how to put all of that together quite yet. So the two-word utterances are pretty common as children develop into that infant stage. If we're talking about dual language infants and toddlers and the learning with two-word utterances, again, some children use syntax from only one language. They make up their own. They code switch, they language switch, where they're using words and terms from each of the different languages. So something pretty common that happens because of the amount of complexities, number one, in learning one language, but when you have two languages in there, it can be difficult for those infants and toddlers. We know that very young infants have well-developed areas of the brain associated with language. Okay? It's very active when they are young, and especially the more language and communication that is used in their early years, the better off they are in regards to that brain activity. Okay? But it can be specific to the language, their main language or their native language by 4 months of age. Okay? And the activity is also localized in the brain at that auditory cortex by 20 months old as well. So activity suggests children distinguish whether words sound different and whether they are familiar or not. Okay, so again, by 20 months before 2 years old, they can do that. And then left interior frontal gyrus is active when children produce or comprehend multi-word utterances. So lots of parts of the brain are functioning, being active, learning, growing, developing with language development in kids. So literacy experience is super important for our infants and toddlers. Okay? Parents read aloud, infants hold the book and turn pages, book babble, just reading in general, whether they're sitting on your lap, right next to you, even in the same room. Very important for that literacy experience to be had by infants and toddlers. Okay, by 15 months, infants can point to objects illustrated in books, and by 18 months, they can reenact certain story events as well. Okay, so it is a lot can be going on with those youngsters, especially if you read a book to them multiple times. They start to recognize words, pictures, events, even the storyline. Okay? there are so there's interventions that focus on increasing literacy activities in the family. We know how important it is. We know sometimes families struggle with access to books, having books at home, being able to read, with kids and with their family. So if we can provide, book exchanges, book fairs, opportunity to share books, to exchange books, whatever it might be. Even doesn't have to be a book. It can be, a copy of something or whatever. But helping families understand the importance of literacy and reading at home and the importance of that. Conditions that affect language. So hearing impairment, okay? Hearing impairment is something that can affect language development because if infants are not hearing things and they don't know, they're not figuring out how to develop that language or use that language. Okay, so for infants that have hearing impairment, babbling is typical until about 6 months old. Then it decreases. Okay, that may never produce a complex babbling or expressive jargon like other infants do. So that's something we want to make sure and try to pay attention to. Okay. If we notice that there might be some hearing impairment or something might be going on, we want to respond quickly with interest when the infants communicate. Use language even if the child hears very little. Use total communication and practice turn taking. Okay, as well as looking for resources, getting screenings, getting some help with any hearing impairments that might be taking place. Okay. With an infant that has Down syndrome, babbling and early words are delayed. Okay, so we won't see them as early as we do in other infants. There is limited response to others' language. Make few requests and initiate a few conversations. Early intervention, though, in language-rich environment will facilitate a large vocabulary development. Okay, so yeah, children with Down syndrome does not necessarily mean that they won't have a strong language background or they can't develop a strong language or vocabulary. They can just need to, again, have that language-rich environment that is super important for every child, no matter what. So. Lastly, general language delay. So language delay is not due to any other disorder or condition. It just is that babbling or words resembling the vocalization of much younger, typically developing children. So it takes them a little bit longer to develop their language. Okay, it usually catches up over time, but it may not. So some things that we can do in the classroom. We can name objects, have them name objects and actions and events. So continuously using language, using vocabulary. Respond with expansion and expectation, meaning we want them to expand on an answer, talk about things a little bit more. We also talk about things a little bit more so they hear more language, hear more vocabulary. So it's important to engage them in some natural conversation. Talk about a variety of things, sit with them at lunch once in a while and visit with them about something. So just helping them, kids that have a general language delay just need that extra time and effort and communication, conversation, vocabulary, language to catch up and to be able to hear and practice using that language. Okay, so that's chapter 8. Go back, use the book, use the PowerPoints to complete your quiz.